next panelists are Ann Packer and Sarah Stein. Okay, I've just got to say about Some Bright Nowhere, this book had me at hello. Ann Packer is so good at character and tension among a multitude of other talents. When her main character, Claire, who's entering home hospice after a long battle with cancer, tells her devoted husband he needs to move out so her two best friends can care for her during her last days, I crumbled for him and for her, and I think you will too. Stunning book. Ann Packer is the author. The title is Some Bright Nowhere, by the way. Anne is the author of 5 previous works of fiction, including the best-selling novels The Children's Crusade and The Dive from Clausen's Pier, which received the Kate Chopin Literary Award, among other prizes and honors. Her short fiction has appeared in The New Yorker, and her novels have been published around the world. She and her husband divide their time between New York, the Bay Area, and Maine, which I hope is not too exhausting, Anne. Sarah Stein is an executive editor at Harper, an imprint of HarperCollins, where she acquires literary and upmarket fiction and narrative nonfiction. Thank you.
So, for many years, whenever anyone would ask who the dream author I would have on my list, my answer was Ann Packer. And now with Some Bright Nowhere, I have the honor of being her editor. This is Ann's first book in 10 years, one that highlights the radical empathy that so distinguishes Ann's work. This book is about the last days of a marriage, when a wife's final request upends the years of understanding on which a family has been built, and probes what it means to truly love someone and the limits of understanding that a partnership contains. And the jumping off point for Some Bright Nowhere is when a wife makes a heartbreaking request at the end of a long and happy marriage. I've been a fan of yours for ages, years before I became your editor, and I've always loved how your books explore the friction that occurs when a person's desires for self bump up against their duty to their community. Can you talk about how this plays out in the relationship between Elliot and Claire, the couple at the center of your book?
Absolutely. And thank you so much. And thanks, Lee, and everybody for having us here. I think what was interesting for me in terms of getting into this book was how you could handle in fiction the kind of unthinkable moment that just stops everything. And I wanted to look at this marriage through the lens of an end of life moment. Claire, Elliott's wife, is in the final days of her long multi-year, I'm not going to say battle with cancer because she doesn't like that. And for her to make a decision, as Lee said, and as you've said, she decides that she thinks her women friends would give her the dying and the death that she actually wants. And she asks him to do this for her. And it's sort of like, how can he say no? How can he say yes? And I wanted to explore the way that self-interest and other interests, for want of a better term, are constantly banging up against each other in life. I feel like it's something that I've been working on kind of throughout my career, looking at the sort of the personal versus the collective. And in my first novel, The Dive from Clausen's Pier, the narrator asks rhetorically, how much do we owe the people we love? And I think I've been trying to answer that question now for 25 years or more.
And it also, what I love so much about it is it's about how much we owe the people that we love, but on the other hand of that, how much we owe ourselves. And what does it mean to pursue self-happiness and your own desires when those are at friction with what the people around you want, and that kind of the sense of selfishness versus selflessness. I think when you and I have talked about this book, and when we've talked about it with your agent, who is also equally brilliant, we've talked about how you wanted this book to cut like a knife. And I want to talk about like what does that actually mean in practice? It's a novel, and yet you talk about it cutting and being sharp. So how does that how does that feel?
It's interesting from very early on in the writing process, and this was a book that I wrote very, very quickly. I've had books that have taken 10 years. I think this book, the first draft, took me 4 months. And the entire time I was getting going with it, I was thinking it has to be like a knife. And I didn't even stop to ask myself what I meant by that. But I think what I really meant was slim and pointed. It's a very short novel. It's the kind of book that people might read in 2 days or even one long afternoon. And I wanted to convey the complexity of the situation for Elliot, the husband, and also for Claire, his wife. And in fact, you're exactly right. When you ask the question, how much do we owe the people we love? It's not going to be a problem if it's not costing you something on the other side. And for Elliot, the um the the desire, the necessity um to give Claire what she's asking for, even if he doesn't really understand why she's asking for it, sort of drives everything. But the book then asks, well, then what would happen? What would happen if you were asked by the person you love most in the world to do something that so shocked you that you could hardly even imagine doing it, and yet you have to? What does providing something that feels so hard to give, what does that feel like? And I wanted to really, like a knife, cut close to the bone for Elliot, so that the reader could really be with him on this journey of, going through this transition in his wife's life without her.
What's interesting to me and what was interesting to me when I first read the book, and I was a little bit like, "Oh, that's different," is that, I think we're so used to fiction, particularly fiction that is about women to be told from women's perspectives. And this, you tell the story from Elliot's perspective. And I think what I found so profound about it is the way in which it tells a story of how masculinity and patriarchy trap men as much as women. And I'm curious about this decision of point of view, the decision not to tell. You don't even have Claire's POV at all. So everything you understand about Claire, you understand through how Elliot is witnessing her and reacting to her. And I think that that tension is really important for Elliot's journey. So I'm curious about this decision to be so deep inside Elliot without giving space for Claire to have her own sections.
I could so readily and completely imagine the experience that the women would have, Claire and her two friends. Being in my 60s, I've now had the unfortunate experience of being close to people who have gone through this kind of illness and, in fact, lost their lives to it. And I was very involved with two friends and their families. Through a journey like this. And so I felt like I really, really understood that. I heard about a situation like the one that is depicted in the novel. And the thing I just couldn't imagine was, what would that be like for the husband? Forget what kind of husband, forget if he's, and I don't really think this way anyway, but forget if he's like a good husband or a bad husband. He's a human being who's at this really important juncture in his life, being asked to step aside. And indeed, patriarchy has given him, a fairly traditional marriage. He's been, the primary breadwinner. He's traveled for work. She's been sort of, though she worked, front and center with the children. And the the experience of her illness has introduced him very late in life to what it actually means to take care of somebody. And I really wanted to explore how that would feel for a man, born when I was in the late 50s.
And I think what's so lovely about it is you get into this distinction between providing and taking care. And I think that that's really important. I think it gets into a lot of conversations that we're having currently about masculinity and how to teach masculinity. And even though the book itself is about this couple, I feel like there's pieces of it that can be extracted to a larger conversation about where we are in the world today.
Yeah, I think so. It's so funny when you write a book, you're not thinking, what will the readers be talking about? You're just you're in those characters, you're in those sentences. And then afterward, when you start this lovely process of, getting the book ready to go out into the world, you sort of discover what the themes are and what the discussable themes are as you get the book ready for publication, which has just been fascinating and such a great and fun part of working with you.
Which will be in January, and I am so excited about this book, and I'm so thrilled that, like, everybody can read this thing I've been obsessed with. So thank you, Anne, and thank you, Lee, and everybody at BuzzBooks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, I just want to emphasize what a great read this book is. It's so profound, and it's so like intimate, but you can relatable at the same time. I was completely wowed by it,